Hey, Eric.
Hey, Chris.
I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Excellent.
Let's talk to somebody else.
Good.
All right, hot sounds. Welcome to Retrograde Amnesia. My name is Chris. This is Eric. Hello, Eric.
Hi.
Hey, Eric, is the fake net here today?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, fake net.
Initializing fake net.
Hello, Chris. Wow, I have never been introduced early enough to talk over the music. Just wanted to remind everyone that your public library, if you have one, usually loans out ebooks alongside physical books. Free books to your electronic reading device. Check it out. Trust my digital drip.
Ugh.
No, okay. In this episode, we will be chatting with Aidan Moher about his upcoming book, Fight Magic Items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West, available on October 4th, 2022. Aidan is a Hugo Award-winning writer and editor who has written about almost every niche facet of geek culture you can think of. He's written essays on Lunar Silver Star Story, The Undeniable Lasting Power of Chrono Trigger, and The Forgotten History of Magic the Gathering. He's written for outlets like Wired, Kotaku, EGM, Uncanny Magazine, FanBiteTour.com, and more. And for no particular reason, my personal favorite piece that he has written was one about Video Game Book Club podcast. I don't know why. I thought that one was just excellent. Aidan, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
Yes, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to read your book and talk about it. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it's wild to me that people are reading it. I wrote it quite quickly last summer, edited it this winter, and now all of a sudden people are reading it. There's a lot of reasons why it was really compressed. I'm handing it off to my editor, to people reading it. It's been really short, and so I feel like a little unprepared.
No, it's awesome. It's awesome. You've chosen a podcast to come talk about it on where I would say 100% of the audience will be interested in the book. But before we get into it, we got to talk about the cover. Like I've read the book, but I am not canceling my pre-order because I love the cover. Can you please tell us about the cover and the artist?
Yeah, I'm obsessed with it as well. I've always back in my book blogger days, I was a book blogger before I was a games writer. Mm-hmm. And I was always obsessed with, digging into and dissecting cover art. And so when I was talking to my editor and we were going through some artists, we picked out a few kind of top level ones. And then we finally settled on Sarah
Alpha G. Her name is Sarah Alpha G. Check out more of her work at saralpha.com. That's SARA-ALFA.com.
She's a huge JRPG fan. She's just a big nerd. And that crossover really worked because she was able to bring that experience she had with the genre to the art in a way that felt really natural and full of Easter eggs. If you look at that image, there's a ton of stuff that you can recognize from various different Japanese RPGs without explicitly being, lightning, but you do get part of her costume in there. And so we worked through some sketches and, made a few tweaks and stuff, but basically what she delivered right off the bat was pretty perfect.
Yeah.
So that covered the art. And then I actually was really fortunate that I pitched the original version of this book to my eventual agent as Fight Magic Items. Mm-hmm. That was the title that I came up with. As an author, you don't always get to do that. You pitch it, you give a couple titles, but at the end of the day, it's sort of like your editor, the marketing team, a whole bunch of people will get in and you'll all settle on a title. It even had a different title at one point during the process, but we kept coming back to Fight Magic Items. And so to see that treatment kind of brought over into the cover, with the 4 blue blocks, which is pulled right out of a combat system from a Japanese RPG, was really fun because it's one of those things that it looks good on its own in a vacuum, but anybody who's a fan of the genre knows right away what that is, right? Yeah. There's that color of blue that's really identifiable as older Final Fantasy games. The combat system style menu for the cover treatment was awesome. And it just I didn't know what to expect, getting my first book cover and something for a niche title like this. But Sarah and the art team at my publisher, Running Press, just really nailed it because they all love these games and sort of geek culture as well. So they knew exactly what we were going for.
In your book, you talk about the history of JRPGs, and it's kind of told through the lens of somebody that grew up with the medium. It makes it very personal. What made you want to tell the story through your personal experiences with the JRPG genre?
Yeah, so I kind of came to games writing initially through that lens of trying to take all these like feelings and experiences I had as a kid growing up. And so I started writing about older Japanese RPGs and people liked it. So I wrote a few different things and I'd always put a little bit of my own experience in there. It actually kind of started with Eric Smith, who's my agent now. We've been friends on Twitter, but he came forward and he's like, hey, when are we going to do a book with all your gaming essays? And I was like, well, I don't really have enough essays to like do a full book, but let me think on that. And so that turned into a pitch for Fight Magic Items. And so baked into the very like foundation of the book was the idea that like I wanted to share the emotional journey people go on through their fandom. I didn't want it to read like, a Wikipedia entry, right? I wanted to share the feelings I had with other people who probably had those feelings. And if they didn't, try to give them an idea of what it was like to grow up with these games and then grow older with these games. So it was a lot of like, just write what you know, write what I'm good at. And then, I also wanted to, again, like not wanting to do like a Wikipedia. I didn't want somebody to be able to go and basically get the book off Wikipedia. I wanted something that was a little more focused, had a little more narrative to it. And that's why I picked the kind of Western angle to it. Like not just the history of Japanese RPGs, but specifically like the rise of popularity in the West and what led to that. And so that gave me another angle there that was also kind of tapped into my own personal experience. And I know the personal experience of millions of other people. And so kind of staying focused around that, it made sense to bring that angle into like as much of the book as I could. And it comes in and out. Yeah. I wasn't around, like I was 3 years old when Final Fantasy was released, right? So I wasn't playing that right away. And so, I worked on ways to figure out how to bring my voice and my experience into that. And then I really kind of come into the book at one point when I really kind of like dive into fandom, and then it sort of evolves outward from there. And it was a juggling act through revisions and stuff to find the right balance of that. Sometimes it was a little too heavy. Sometimes parts of the book needed a little bit more of that to keep that thread going. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And early like impressions and early reviews, people seem to kind of glom on to that feeling of being there with me as I take that journey.
Yeah, it's interesting that people from all over the world, I mean, you're from Canada, we're from the US and Kentucky, but we've all had these very similar experience in growing up and kind of discovering these things along the way. And I think you sell that pretty well.
One of the issues I took with the book Console Wars was its deification and embellishment of industry figures like Sega's Tom Kalinske. In Fight Magic Items, you had no problem calling balls and strikes with Koichi Sugiyama, but you also didn't portray Yuji Ori or Hironobu Sakaguchi as anything more than human. How tough was the process of carving relatable human figures from archived interviews and ultimately as producers of work you respect and admire?
It was really hard. Writing from specifically like a Western angle, I didn't want to rely too much on like trying to like reach out and get like modern day interviews with these people. I wanted to reach back into the past and get the words that they were using at that time. All of the interviews that exist are also, they're through a PR angle. And so it got harder as the book went on, in particular, to pull out like personal stories about people. But back in the 80s, it was like a Wild West, right? These were just guys in their 20s, women in their 20s, and they would talk and talk and talk because nobody knew. And like the gaming industry hadn't really evolved. So you get a lot of really kind of personal insight. It's not nearly as guarded as interviews are now. Like, you see Sakaguchi and he's talking about Terra Battle and somebody tries to ask him a Dragon Quest question and it just gets shut down, right? So you can't really get anything out of them anymore. But back then you got really a lot of deep personal insight into it. And so, Sugiyama was really a really hard part of the book. It was one of the hardest parts of the book to write, and it's like 2 pages. It's not very long. But like, I had so much and so much love for his music. But I was also frustrated by the way he kind of treated the music, especially for Western releases, in the way that he would kind of hold back licensing rights. Dragon Quest XI, when it first released on the PlayStation 4 version, I think was the first one that came out in America. And like it had like chip tunes.
It was MIDI files, yeah.
Instead of the orchestral stuff. It was awful. And that was, there's a reverence for the work that I just wanted. Everybody wants the best version of it except Sugiyama. And so like as a fan, that was frustrating. And then there's all the other like legitimately problematic, like political, moral stuff that he was into. And so threading that needle to say like, hey, this guy brought a lot to the genre. He was a big name before Japanese RPGs were even a thing. Mm-hmm. And so like to have him bringing that music and like legitimizing the genre in that way was really important. But he was also a really problematic guy. And so like threading that needle, I went back and forth a lot and had a few different people kind of read and give feedback on that because I wanted to make sure that I got it right. Calling strikes where I saw them because there was a lot there. And on the flip side, like as I was kind of saying earlier, I wanted the book to be like a personal journey through Japanese RPGs, and not just mine, but also for the people who made them. I initially, like really early on in the process, my pitch for the book was the history of Japanese RPGs and the people who made them. And so the whole story like wanted to be about not just the games, but the people, and, you know, why did they make them? What did they put into these games? Why did their like personal circumstances help shape the genre, especially in those early days? And so if you start digging into those stories, you can't start kind of deifying people, right? You can't start placing people on either side of, you know, like a divide and saying these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, because, you know, Sakaguchi wasn't an easy guy to work with all the time. He was really challenging, and that created issues for Final Fantasy and the Square teams early on, you know, when nobody really wanted to come onto his team before he'd even created Final Fantasy. And so those are interesting, right? We don't want to read about perfect deities. We want to read about imperfect people, complex people. And I think that just tells a more interesting story. And because there's just that treasure trove of early interviews in the 80s and 90s, you can pull together a lot of really interesting stories just looking at how they talk about their experiences before they really knew what they were even building.
Was the book planned for Sakaguchi and Yuji Horii to be kind of the through lines that kind of carry everything forward, or is that just kind of how it came out in terms of what you were able to gather?
They were always important to the book, so that like the book always started with them and their stories and then the creation of their series. The initial outlines weren't quite as focused specifically on them, but about halfway through I realized, okay, if I write this whole book, it's going to be, you know, twice as long. It's already a long book. And it's going to be, you know, like 160,000 words instead of 110, which is where it ended up. And so I looked and I was like, well, it's, you know, starting off with Sakaguchi and Horii, and they're still like, you know, it's 2022 and they're still impactful, right? They're still creating games that people are interested in. And they've diverged so much on their vision for what Japanese RPGs are and how they approach making new games. Let's make that the through line. And it was, you know, there was lots in there that already existed for their stories. The book's broken down into about 6 different parts, and every part I would check in with each of them anyway. So then it was about sort of bringing in the through line into other parts of the story and how games were impacted by Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, or how they might have gone on to impact and influence those games into the future, and really kind of focus in on that dual narrative of like my journey as a young fan to like a teenage fan to an adult fan, but also that simultaneous journey of, especially like, you know, Sakaguchi as a very young creator to like, you know, a storied superstar creator to then now a creator entering sort of the twilight of his career, and what that means and how he looks back on his journey and what he's created and what that means going forward, how he can continue to contribute.
I think the fandom generally holds those two guys up as the pillars of the JRPG canon. If you had to throw like one or two other people on there to be on I hate Mount Rushmore questions, but this is a Mount Rushmore question. Like, who are the other, doesn't have to be two, but who are the other few people that you would put as equivalent in terms of influence next to those guys?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going like way back into the past, we've got to look at Reiko Kodama and Phantasy Star and the team that she worked with at Sega to create Phantasy Star, because I think it, in like a lot of ways, it was just as vital as Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest in terms of like showing how broad Japanese RPGs can be. Like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were like fantasy adventures, right? Very Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Whereas Phantasy Star brought in like a stronger narrative. It brought in a female protagonist. It brought in a futuristic setting sort of mixed in with fantasy. And so they were really kind of biting off a bigger chunk of like, hey, how far can we push this? And so was a guy like Shigesato Itoi, who created the Mother series. You know, he took that idea of like, oh, okay, these games are cool, but they're all fantasy. What happens if we set this in real world or an analog of real world? And so he set, you know, a Japanese RPG set in small town America. And so those two, I think, are really important. They created a lot of foundations for games that like still exist, right? And still have huge fandoms. Like we're still seeing stuff that's like heavily influenced by Phantasy Star and Earthbound, even if new games in those series are few and far between or just completely done. We're reaching the point where the kids who were playing Japanese RPGs grew up discovering the genre with Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger. They're making games now, right? And so you can look to kind of some of the younger people coming up. Tetsuya Takahashi, who obviously most of the listeners of this podcast probably know for creating Xenogears, which you guys covered in your first season, and Xenoblade and all of those. Like, he's really done a lot to popularize Japanese RPGs with a modern 2022 audience. He's been around for a long time. He was working on the Super Nintendo. He created the mechs in the opening to Final Fantasy VI, right? Like, he's been around forever. So he's not necessarily young, but he's sort of taking a mindset of like, okay, here's everything that's happened in gaming. How can I pull that into Japanese RPGs and create something that feels modern and not tied too much to the past? I think Yoko Taro obviously has done a lot of interesting things. His games are more action oriented. They're not, turn-based RPGs, but I don't know how he did it, but he convinced, Square to throw tons of money at him to make weird games that I love. And then I think I've got to mention Yoshi P, who saved Final Fantasy XIV. I can't think of a Japanese RPG that's had a bigger impact than Final Fantasy XIV over the past decade or however long it's been around. And its story, which I cover in the book, of being like an absolute unmitigated disaster to begin with, and then Yoshi P coming in and saving it, and then it turning into like one of the biggest games out there now. Like, that's just such a remarkable story. I don't know if Final Fantasy XIV is a JRPG. It has a bunch of the ideas from JRPGs, but I think that's also where the genre is going. That it's, it's blending and it's becoming many, many new things.
I thought you were going to say Yoko Taro and Yoshi P, so I feel good about it. So, but I like the other ones.
Can I submit Akitoshi Kawazu as the person plotting to blow up Mount Rushmore and just put his face on there? Yeah, something incomprehensible.
He turned it into a board game. It'd be like Mount Rushmore, the board game. It's the size of a state. Yeah.
So I've written a bunch of video game reviews, and I always do my best not to reuse metaphors or rely on easy turns of phrase, but it's one of the personally irritating parts of the writing process. Also something that I notice when I read both fiction and nonfiction from other authors. Fight Magic Items consistently found ways to state its ideas without turning back to the same language structure, and I was curious, as part of your creative process, if that's a conscious decision while you're writing, or if that's an unavoidable element that gets revised a lot during editing.
I'm actually like really tickled to hear you say that, because that's something I think about a lot, and it irritates me in my own writing a lot. And so like, I get to page proofs, and I've read the book a few times, and I'm like, I kind of said that same thing in like chapter 8, and I'm on chapter 14, and is it too late to change it? I have a really like non-linear writing style as well, like actually writing the book. Like, I don't start on page 1, word 1 and just write to the end. Yeah. Like, I wrote, I might be working on chapter 3 one day and then chapter 14 and then bouncing around. And even within those chapters, I'm working all over the place, kind of constructing it like a puzzle, one piece at a time, rather than writing linear, in a linear way. And so I'll also write the same thing in multiple places on purpose. And then like my idea is like, I'll go back and like revise those out of there.
Right.
And so I am constantly looking for like repetitions. And if you read my first drafts, they're like full of repetitions, whether that's repetitious, like, ideas, or like even what you're talking about with like structure for how I'm describing something. Right. And so I'm constantly looking for ways to like, if I need to say that again, in this chapter, how can I say it in a different way that recontextualizes the point that's more specific to the game that I'm talking about or the situation I'm talking about. Books also get edited down a lot. Like, the first draft was 125,000 words, and I think the final draft is about 110.
Wow.
So, like, I cut out a ton, and that was, it's 110 with a bunch of added content in, right? So like, I cut out 15, 20,000 words out of the first draft. And so, there's a lot that gets written that first time around. It was really one really freeing thing for me, was like freeing myself to like get it wrong on the first draft. I used to really agonize over getting the first draft right. Mm-hmm. And any revisions were like failures. But once I was like, oh no, I can get this all, like, I can write whatever I need to and I can fix it later. I'll revise it. I'll get the words out now and fix it later. I've always kind of thought like first drafts are telling yourself the story, and then second drafts and revisions are for telling the reader the story.
It's a really good way to state it.
How much Xenogears content did you cut?
How much Xenogears content did I cut? I didn't actually cut that much. I wanted to focus on Xenoblade in the book. As much as I like Xenogears and would have loved, I could have written multiple chapters on Xenogears. I'm playing through it. I'm like right at the very end of a replay right now. And it's fantastic. And like, it's just so like hilarious to me to like play it now and be like, this was like the follow-up to Final Fantasy VII. I know Saga Frontier was in there, but that one was weird for its own reasons. Yeah. But like, I was just the perfect age. I think we all were for Xenogears, right? Final Fantasy VII and Xenogears, like, we didn't know what was going on, but we knew it was like supposed to be profound. And so like I have a pretty strong emotional attachment to Xenogears and would have loved to have written like a ton of stuff in there, but kind of had to save space.
I think you made the right choice.
Yeah.
Because Xenoblade is a very important contemporary game.
My next question kind of piggybacks off what Chris said. In your book, you said, and I'm quoting, "One of the biggest challenges in writing this book was picking and choosing series and games for in-depth coverage." How did you choose your canon of JRPGs for your book? And was the availability of reference material and creator interviews a factor in determining your focus?
Yeah, definitely. There were instances where like I probably would have wanted to dive deeper into certain titles if there were more available resources out there. That being said, you know, like this, I didn't want this to be a super like niche book just for like fans who have devoted their whole lives to this genre. And so, you know, you do kind of pick and choose based on the popularity of the series and the games. I wanted to tell the story of like how and why did these explode in popularity in the West. And so that kind of gave a general focus on, you know, the biggest and most popular games, and then kind of dabbling a little bit in some of the more niche titles that might have done interesting things, introduced stuff to the genre without necessarily becoming a big mainstream hit. I was playing pretty much everything, especially during the first half of the book. Up until, you know, the end of the PlayStation 2 era, I was playing pretty much every game. So I had some sort of personal experience with every game. I drew a lot on that. Where was sort of the weft and wend of the genre as it went through its paces, you know, during the PlayStation era, as we were getting Final Fantasy games, you know, one a year, right? I think 9 and 10 came out within less than a year of each other. And you get like, you know, and then what filled in the gaps there? What were we talking about? What was going on at, you know, among our friend group? And then sort of taking those games and seeing where they went. Where did they lead the genre? What games and creators did they sort of inspire into the future? As the author, kind of touching on the second part of your question, is like, I could have written a book that was twice as long. Like my outline, I have a whole folder in my project folder that's just like cut chapters and cut chapter ideas and concepts. I wrote full chapters into the book that, you know, ended up being taken out for one reason or another. And I agonize over that, right? I think, you know, in the book's sort of afterword, I say like, there could be another version of this book that covered Suikoden in more in depth, or it went into the Tales of series more, you know, more closely, and it followed a different path, right? Because everybody's journey through the genre is also different. A lot of us hit on all the big like mainstream games, right? Like Final Fantasy is pretty ubiquitous, but it's all those other little games that made up our experiences. And, you know, I had to leave out some games and series that, you know, are pretty special to me, but I couldn't really necessarily find how they shaped things going forward, or they didn't have that big catalyst moment where they were like the thing everybody was talking about, despite being, you know, fairly popular among like a passionate fan base, or one of my favorites. I love the Tales of series on the PlayStation and through the PlayStation 2. And I do, you know, I cover them, but at the same time, you know, I had to make room for some of the other stories that I felt fit the narrative thread throughout the book. So I wanted to write a whole chapter about the Sega Saturn. Eric, I know you're a fan of the Saturn. It's an amazing Japanese RPG system, but not in North America, right? They all stayed in Japan. And that's what I wanted to write about, like sort of the lost generation of Japanese RPGs. Like the best versions of some JRPGs are on the Saturn. Like the best version of Grandia is on the Saturn. There's a version of Lunar on the Saturn that's pretty good and isn't hobbled by working designs as gameplay changes. And I wanted to write about that and what that means and what it would have been like if the Saturn had been a success in North America, but it wasn't. And so ultimately, like that angle of like exploring, especially that post Final Fantasy VII era where the genre was like really booming, and games that previously might have sold like 60,000 copies were selling 500,000 now. And, you know, exploring that area required me to just focus in on certain games that told the story in the truest way, rather than diverging into stuff that I loved, but couldn't necessarily like support the weight of what came later in the book.
It's a bummer in the publishing world. There's not a Book of the Year edition that comes a year later loaded with DLC and extra chapters.
Book DLC? Don't give me ideas, man. I can't. I would write it all. But actually, like that's a fair point, because I do have a few ideas for chapters that sort of stood like they almost stood on their own a little bit too well to be in the book. Like some of them I wrote, and my editor was like, I don't really know, like, this chapter is interesting, but it's not really like doing anything for the rest of the narrative. She's like, maybe you could like split it up and just put it throughout the book in other places. And I was like, but it's a really good story. And so I do like, and I've managed to sell some of those as like features that'll be coming out to kind of supplement the book's launch and kind of coming out at the same time. So I have a big, long feature on JRPG localization in the 90s. I talked with Alex O. Smith, who did Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy 12. I talked with Richard Honeywood, who like basically created modern game localization in Japanese RPGs. He came in sort of on Final Fantasy 8. You can see that evolution of Final Fantasy 7 being like borderline unreadable at times. And then Final Fantasy 8's like, not great, but it's like
it's much better.
It's competent. And then by Final Fantasy, 9 and through like the rest of the PlayStation era, like in 4 years, it goes from unreadable to like Vagrant Story. And that's because of, the small group of people led by people like Richard Honeywood who realized like, okay, if we want to sell these games in the West, because they're selling all of a sudden, we need to do more. And so, I wrote that into a big feature that'll be coming out sometime in the next few weeks leading up to the book's release. And I'm excited to be able to tell those stories. I have a few others that I'm kind of working on. I might send some out, through my newsletter or post them online somewhere just to get them out there because they stand on their own quite nicely.
Awesome. We'll keep an eye out for it. I'm anxious to read those.
Yeah, we're big Richard fans in this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, he's great. You guys were like I was listening to your Xenogears season as I was like doing a lot of these interviews and stuff, and I was just starting to play Xenogears again and listen to your guys' podcast, and you guys would be sort of like making fun of some of the localizations, and I was out on a walk, like sort of standing for Richard and everything he had to deal with translating those games, and it's just like it's such a wild west. It's just crazy what they went through, the resources that they had. And, there's just stories about like Richard being the first white employee in Square's offices. And he's riding an elevator and the two Japanese employees, his colleagues, are standing there talking in Japanese about how they can't believe they'd hire a white guy. Yeah. And he's standing there because they assume that he doesn't understand what they're saying. And he's standing there listening to them the whole time. So stories like that coming out about how challenging it was at the time, but also, like how through like proactive effort, they did create change and the value was there, and they kept showing the value over and over and over again, so that the parent companies had to take notice, and it changed Japanese RPGs. I think the work that they did. We've
seen that evolution sort of on our podcast because we saw Xenogears, which he did mostly by himself, and then Chrono Cross, and then Final Fantasy VIII, and now we're seeing what Konami did, how Konami treated Suikoden, and it's just, even though Suikoden 2 came after some of these games, it's rough out there at times. It's not quite as punchy and fluffy as Richard Honeywood's translations are.
And that changes with 3. Like Suikoden 3 is a huge step up from the first 2 games.
Yeah, I want to take a look at that. Yeah,
I think 2 came out around the time of Final Fantasy 8, right? And so it was still like we were still pretty early in that game localization timeline. But by the time 3 comes around, like the localization's like just way better.
I enjoyed the excerpt. Why keep track of all that game data when the computer can do it for you, as a means of articulating the difference between tabletop games and video games? The former has rarely appealed to me, and the latter is one of my favorite hobbies. I love video games, but I can never find the patience for tabletop games.
I've seen that firsthand.
With that in mind, do you think it's possible for JRPGs to go too far with what they're handling for the player? Or do you trust that automated systems in games like Final Fantasy 12 or Xenoblade Chronicles are eliminating tedium out of the genre, leaving the player to better create their own strategies?
I mean,
like what are you more into?
Yeah.
Type thing.
It's a good question. I think like I don't begrudge anybody who likes Xenoblade Chronicles and like Tales of Arise and some of the Tales games that are like system on system on system on system and system, and it's like almost impossible to see how some of them overlap. It's not for me. Like I don't like that. I struggled through Xenoblade Chronicles 2 because I just like, it's not that I didn't get the systems. I understood the combat system. I understood everything that went into it, but it was just like I don't really want to do that.
Yes.
Right. Like I came to Japanese RPGs because I liked the adventure of it. It wasn't about like the complicated battle systems and or character building systems and stuff. Like when I look back on my favorites in the genre, like I love Chrono Trigger, and I don't just love Chrono Trigger because of like, it's almost a meme at this point that I like Chrono Trigger, but it's like, I genuinely like it because it distilled ideas down into like its bare essence and did away with anything that wasn't necessary. And I feel like games, like as much as I'm enjoying Xenoblade 3, it still has way too many systems. I want to sit down and count the currencies. There's like there's got to be 15 different currencies in the game that don't overlap. There's like gold Nopon coins, silver Nopon coins, there's CP and SP and experience and gold. And like, I'm still getting tutorials for new currency systems in that game. And it just seems unnecessary to me. Like I want something that really boils down so that the majority of my time is spent on the adventure and like moving that forward. So that's in some ways kind of turned me off of a lot of modern Japanese RPGs. Like when those systems, I think really, I feel like when they started leaving handhelds, and we'll probably get into this later in the podcast, but they kind of like, Japanese RPGs were huge on consoles. Then we hit the HD era. They disappeared from consoles. They moved to handhelds, and on handhelds, they were simple by nature. They couldn't do too much. The UIs were low resolution. You could only convey so much information. There's only so much access to memory to be able to have complex systems. But then they sort of reemerged on consoles, and I feel like that's when they started to get really blown up. And so you saw something like the Xenoblade games. The Wii one was pretty complex, but 2 in particular, or the more recent Tales games, they took a level of complexity that where on the PlayStation 2 era, like Final Fantasy 12 had an MMO style combat system, but it also had fairly simple like character progression systems, like the license board and the Gambit system were like, you're doing fairly simple programming, and then you have like a chessboard where you just use points to unlock new skills. Those are simple, whereas like now Xenoblade's extrapolated that into system on system on system on system. I want every single button click that I put into a Japanese RPG to make a difference, and I don't feel that that's the case in a lot of new ones. Like I dropped Tales of Arise because it felt like they built a combat system that was around like abusing this like break and topple system, but they wanted you to really feel like you earned it. So then the enemies are damage sponges. So then you're just spending so much time kind of like playing with these systems that you feel like maybe the developers just really want you to notice. Whereas I don't necessarily want to notice all the systems in the games that I play. But that's also, I'm 38. I've been playing these games for a long time. I just might be getting older and my taste, your tastes get entrenched, right? Same way you don't discover new music after the age of 25, right? Because you have enough albums to listen to. I can recognize that maybe some of this stuff's just not for me, and that's okay. And so, like that was also an interesting part of the book to look at how those are changing and how I fit into all of that. I think that there's some really interesting stuff being done in the indie space that, again, they have smaller teams and so they kind of simplify in terms of structure or story or gameplay length. There's a great Western made Japanese RPG called Quartet. I kickstarted it. They describe it as Final Fantasy VI for people who have a job. And so like they've kind of streamlined everything. And it's like, it appeals to me because it taps into like a lot of the games that I really used to love growing up, but modernizes them in a way that fits into the life of adults who are working full time, have kids, mortgages, and that kind of thing. And I mean, Pat Holloman.
Yeah, he rules.
Yeah, he's working on it. And it's like, it's just such a great idea. And I don't feel like Xenoblade fits into my life. Like I got to make room for Xenoblade. And I don't think it needs to be that way. I don't think Xenoblade needs to be 100 hours. I think it could tell its story and present its world in 60 hours and still feel like a long game. I don't know if that's been taken too far. It's been taken too far for me sometimes, but there's also more room than ever for different types of games. I'll always want those big blockbuster AAA games, but whatever they've done with Xenoblade 3 has worked for me. Like it does feel like it's refined down a little bit from where 2 was going, like the sprawl. Like why did that game have a gotcha system, right?
Yeah,
didn't even make money, right? Like why would a single player game with no microtransactions have a gotcha system? Like that's not
the kids love blind boxes.
It felt like no one was in the room to say, stop it. Stop doing this.
Yes, exactly. And I actually just did I'm working on a freelance piece. I'm reporting for it. It's about like game development challenges they've run into and how they solved it and stuff. And one of them said like, they're an indie developer and they said like, it's just so easy to glom onto every new idea, right? And to like put it into your game and put it into your game and put it into your game. But until you stop to like look at how that creates a system that like works as a whole ecosystem, you don't know if it's working, and more isn't always better. I think that we're going through a period where Japanese RPGs, like mainstream kind of AAA ones like Xenoblade, they're expanding, and then there'll probably be it's an experimental phase. And I talk about that in my book. I find that the generations go through sort of experimental generations and then generations of like refinement and polish. And I think we're in an experimental generation right now. And so I could see there being a period of like tightening and polishing of some of these ideas that kind of brings it back to that core idea of like Dungeons and Dragons, but on your TV, right? Where like in Dungeons and Dragons, like every single action you take matters. It shapes and moves forward the game in some way. And, when I'm jamming buttons and arts and stuff in Xenoblade, I don't feel like any of them matter except the last one. Because you're going through like, you're just going through your little cycle. And it's no different if I have to, like use this art 4 times in a round of combat or 1 time or 12 times, like the outcome's all the same.
My next question was about that phase of experimentation and then refinement, progressing from 8-bit to 16-bit, then 32-bit, and then I think the PS2 generation was mostly a refinement thing as well. And I was curious, just as a personal taste thing, do you prefer a game to be experimental with a bunch of wild ideas, or a refined game where that's ironed out those ideas and is just concentrated on what you know and love? Final Fantasy 15 versus Dragon Quest 11, by the way, as an example.
Yeah.
I mean, 15, it's tough to call that an experiment, but...
I'm a 15 apologist. I only played it for the first time last year with all the DLC and stuff.
Oh, God.
But it's an absolute mess, right?
Yeah.
But I love it. I think if I were to look back on those generations, and the way I break it down sort of in my book, as you've just broken it down, is like the experimental generations were like the 8-bit NES, and then the 32-bit polygonal systems like PlayStation, where they had this new technology and they're trying to figure out how do we make games in these molds. And then the 16-bit and the PlayStation 2 generation takes those ideas and refines them into something more just polished. It doesn't experiment as much, but it creates something that's more polished. If you were to ask me, like some of my very favorites are like the very end of the experimental generations. Like I think that stuff like, Vagrant Story is very experimental, but it also has like all the juice and horsepower of those systems. And so they didn't necessarily have to like compensate with some of maybe Vagrant Story is not a great example because it has some really messy systems, but it just shows off everything that experimentation can go to. But I really love Super Nintendo RPGs because a lot of them feel just like really polished up NES RPGs. They're still simple, but they're sort of like, but then they started to experiment more narratively because the systems were down, the kind of like the graphics engines were solved, the combat systems were mostly solved. And so like I really like and find myself going back to play a lot of those. Whereas I find some of the experimental stuff is like, it was interesting at the time. It's interesting from a historical perspective, but like, I don't want to ever play Thousand Arms again. Right. I didn't even really want to play Xenogears again, but I'm glad I did because it, like, as much as I love Xenogears, like it's a slog, right? It's a combat. There's way too much combat. The text is just really slow for some reason, like really slow. And they didn't know what they were doing. It was early in the technology's lifespan. And so they ran out of space. And as much as I like the second disc, like personally, it's like, it's also a mess, right? Whereas you don't get a lot of that necessarily on like those refinement generations. You get games that are really polished and tight. I like going through and living through the experimental stages, but I don't necessarily like going back and revisiting them as much as those like Super Nintendo and PlayStation 2 generations necessarily.
It's a great way to put it.
Yep, I'm glad you mentioned Disc 2 because if you don't like Disc 2, you can't be on this podcast. That's just a rule I think that I just wrote just now. So thank you.
I like it. I'm into it. Yeah, I'm like deep into Disc 2 right now. I'm like, yeah, this is good, man. It's like it was like ahead of its time, right? Like there's all the visual novels out there right now, and I'm playing through Disc 2, and I'm like, this is just a visual novel. Like maybe a little like, I mean, it has dungeons. It's a visual novel with dungeons. It's great. You
talk about this in your book, but Final Fantasy VI's designed by committee approach, at least when it comes to the cast, in my opinion, was created one of the best ensemble casts in the medium. It changed me from a kid who slogged through Dragon Warrior and the original Final Fantasy. I guess I had those experiences because those were the experiences that were put in front of me. But once I got my hands on Final Fantasy VI, I became a full-blown JRPG nut for the next, let's say, 15 years or so. What do you think makes the Final Fantasy VI cast work so well?
You know how you go on to, bear with me for a sec, you go onto Instagram and you see all these pictures and it's beautiful people at beautiful beaches, right? Or is there like amazing looking living room? But if you turn the camera around, you'd see their like, their god awful, like disastrous kitchen that they haven't cleaned up. Mm-hmm. We live in an age where we only see the best of people's lives, and that can create a lot of, envy for people. But I think from a kind of a creative perspective, Final Fantasy VI did that, but with sort of the creative ideas of the people involved with the game. And so instead of having sort of one mind creating a bunch of characters, and they create they create Vivi, and that's pretty cool. Vivi's a great character, right? Steiner's pretty cool, but then they kind of run out of juice, and you get the chef Quina. You get Amaranth, who just he looks cool, but he doesn't do anything. You can tell they sort of run out of steam. I think that often you might just have a couple of great characters in you for any given game. And so Final Fantasy VI, by bringing together the entire team and having people like Soraya Saga and the Kingdom Hearts guy, Nomura, having all of those creative people coming in and giving just their best tube ideas, right? That's really pure and really experimental and innovative. And the fact that the game was made so fast that they didn't have a chance to iterate and condense that down into something closer to other games, I think is really interesting, because then there's something for everybody, right? If there's a single creative team or a single creator making characters for a game, if you don't jive with that creator, you're probably not going to like the game, right? I fell off Kingdom Hearts because I don't really connect with a lot of Nomura's characters, right? I didn't really care for some of his other games and the Final Fantasy games he was heavily involved in. Whereas Final Fantasy VI, everybody has a different favorite character, right? Everybody has a preferred party. And I think that that's just a really interesting aspect of how that game works so well, is that you go in and no matter what, there's somebody there for you, because there's so many different creative minds contributing to the character of that game.
The way that you said that Amaranth looks cool, there was a question mark at the end of it, was very funny to me. With your discovery of Earthbound, I think it was Earthbound, your memory of learning about its existence through a magazine that you picked up at a, quote, liminal gas station during a road trip was such a profoundly relatable way of how children learned about video games in the 90s. I love learning about the ways people discovered games when they were kids, and that seems like such a profoundly clear memory in your book. Do you have any other stories about how you may have come to other RPGs or video games that couldn't find their way into your book?
Yeah, I mean, throughout the book, I talk a lot about those first experiences, or those really strong childhood experiences revolving around games. Way back in the day, that one of the best ways to play games with your friends was your Game Boy, right? So I had a friend, and we would show up at school an hour before the bell rang. Nobody else was there. I grew up in a small community, so we were pretty young, but we could walk to the school. It was the 90s. It was okay, and we would just play Game Boy side by side with each other. Not even linking up. We'd be playing Link's Awakening side by side and just exploring and hanging out doing that. Later on, when I was in high school, I would haul my monitor. I grew up playing on a Commodore 1702 computer monitor. So it's pretty small, pretty light, great little monitor. And I would haul it over to my friend's house, and we would play through Lunar and Xenogears. We'd put our monitors back to back, so we couldn't see each other's screens because we'd be at different parts of the game, and we would just play that way. And so that wasn't necessarily learning about a new RPG, but it was experiencing a new RPG or a new game in a way that doesn't really exist anymore. And so those ones really stick out to me. Ones that they're experiences that you just don't have anymore. I played Dragon Quest VIII, and after 80 hours, I beat the game, and it has a really long ending, but you can't save. And so I beat it early in the morning, and then I had to go to work. And so I had to leave my PlayStation 2 running for 8 hours while the ending just idled on a dialogue box, and then came back home 8 hours later, finished the game, and it was great. And then there was just I hit high school just at the right time when these games were exploding. And so we always just had the next game floating through our friend group, right? Or there'd be crossover friend groups where we'd hear about these other guys and they were playing whatever it is, Suikoden, right? And we'd be well, what's that? What's Suikoden? And then one of our friends would be, over at their house, and he'd be oh yeah, it's so cool. It's got this purple dragon at the beginning. It's amazing. And then he would borrow it, right? And then I'd go over to his house and I'd watch him play an hour of Suikoden. And then you have to wait weeks and weeks for him to finish it. And then it bounces around everybody in the friend group one at a time. And that's always been interesting, because then some games would miss you, right? There's friends who would have some game, Legend of Legaia. I have one friend that loves Legend of Legaia, but my only experience was sitting at his house in his bedroom as he played it. And so that kind of stuff was always interesting. And then you would kind of pick and choose which ones you'd really chase down based on how much fun it looked like your friend was having, with the copy that his friend's friend lent him. And that was really fun. I grew up, like I said, in a small community on an island. So we didn't have Toys R Us, right? Like we couldn't go browse at the video game store and find stuff that way. That was, we'd go to town maybe once a month, right? With our mom, go grocery shopping. Maybe we'd get her to take us to Toys R Us. For the most part, it was all about that grapevine and those copies that were bouncing from friend to friend to friend. I discovered Final Fantasy VI because my parents hired a cool babysitter. And he didn't want to hang out with a bunch of kids, right? And so I was old enough to play video games. We would play Doom together. And then one night he brought over Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy III at the time, and he popped it in. And I just vividly in my mind, I can picture the sound and the screen flash the first time he walked over that save point, and the concept of saving your game in that way. And just that atmospheric moment of being in the Narshe mines and stepping on that first save spot, that's the moment where Japanese RPGs really became a thing for me. Even though I'd experienced other ones. A friend had Final Fantasy Legend 2 on Game Boy, and he was fighting some tiger at the beginning. I was like, this game looks lame, right? I just wanted to chop the Foot Clan, with my katana in the sewers at that time. And he was playing this weird game where you're moving around on the map and it's slow. And I'm like, that game sucks. And so I went back to Ninja Turtles. And then a few years later, leave it to not a younger friend's cousin, but an older, cooler babysitter to be like, hey, this game's sweet. And I'm like, yeah, this game is sweet.
Growing up, did you have any weird publisher biases in the genre? Whenever I walked into a store, I 100% always deferred to a Squaresoft game over others, and I robbed myself of ever renting Lufia or ever trying Wild Arms.
Absolutely. I mean, Squaresoft was it for us, right?
Yeah.
We all played through Final Fantasy VI together, and I was really the only one that owned Chrono Trigger. I was always the type, I would be introduced to something like Final Fantasy VI, and then it would become my mission to be and to own and be the the one with the next one, right? So Final Fantasy VI comes out, I love it, and then I'm scouring all the magazines, and I'm like, oh hey, Chrono Trigger, that's from the guy who made Final Fantasy VI. That's going to be my next game. I don't even know if I knew what publishers were at the time, but I knew it was the guy who created Final Fantasy VI. And so that was my game, and I got it for Christmas or my birthday, and it was amazing. And then we hit high school the next year, and it was, Final Fantasy VII was coming down the pipeline, and then that was just the golden age of Square, right? But we also played them so fast. We'd put 80 hours into an RPG pretty quick back then. So we also had a lot of downtime, and that's where the shared games would kind of cycle through our friends. Yeah. And so as an adult over the past couple of years, I've been filling a lot of gaps in my library of old RPGs, and I have all the Squaresoft ones. So what I'm doing is I'm going back. I bought a copy of Wild Arms. I played Wild Arms, right? But I never owned a copy. And so that's where those those copies that would kind of float through our friend group would come in. I got to play a lot of the best games, or at least dabble in them. And if I liked them, I'd play them all the way. But yeah, it was Squaresoft for us for sure. And then I had, pet series. I was really into Breath of Fire 3 on the PlayStation. And that was just one of, I think, you have limited money. And so when you commit 50 or 60 bucks to a game, you then have to really justify it to yourself. So Breath of Fire 3 is a pretty good game. It was really, it was really interesting at the time with its cool soundtrack and stuff. But you really get into it when you're 14 and you've spent all of your allowance on one game, and you got to like it, right? You got to get your value out of it. And then you spend a lot of time trying to convince everybody else that it's cool.
Yeah. In the book, you weave the story of Yasumi Matsuno. It's the director of Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics, for those that might not know. You weave his story into the larger story of JRPGs by articulating what made his approach in design and writing so different and unique as compared to his peers. Are there any other creators who've brought new sensibilities into JRPGs that people tend to overlook?
Matsuno is just so interesting because he brought that sense of mature kind of epic fantasy politicking into, and I use mature sort of with air quotes, not mature as in blood and guts or whatever, but just the mentality of being okay, how can we tell these intricate, serious stories about war and politics and all of those kind of themes that you generally find in novels for adults or older people versus a lot of the Japanese RPGs at the time that were drawing maybe more on like anime tropes and themes and influences. So he's really interesting, and I think he stands in like a really unique place in how he influenced Japanese RPGs. But at the same time, you had the I think the Suikoden series is really interesting because a lot of people, like myself included, think of it as like Game of Thrones, but a Japanese RPG. But like it predates Game of Thrones. And so it took this idea of like kind of epic fantasy politicking and created these really interesting stories. And the first game is super short, but it's packed with story. And I think that was really unique, that it kind of invested you not just in like, big set pieces and cool moments of like this or that happening. Like Final Fantasy VII wowed because it had these amazing backgrounds and locations and like visually memorable scenes. But Suikoden managed to kind of hook the player despite all of that. Like it's very basic in its presentation. It's got, I love the pixel art, but it's also very like abstract in its representation of its story. But by bringing in sort of these elements and these themes and these tropes from other pieces of literature. So Junko Kawano Murayama just created this, like, again, I'm using the phrase mature in air quotes, but I think that is kind of the way to think of it. Like it wanted to appeal to a new audience. It didn't necessarily play Japanese RPGs, or people who, maybe older players who were sort of in their late teens or early 20s during the Super Nintendo, and then they're getting a little bit older and maybe they're disengaging from video games again. But here are these games that lead into some of the epic fantasy that I'm reading, or, I'm studying, stuff like War of the Roses or like literature in university, and these games are kind of touching on many of the same themes and plot archetypes and plot structures, and that was just really interesting and unique at the time, and I think continues to be that way. We've talked about a lot of them. I think Takahashi and Saga doing what they did on Xenogears, like trying to pitch Xenogears as a Final Fantasy game and just being told like no, that's not going to happen. That's way too dark.
Chill.
It's obviously, yeah, exactly. But like tapping into like everything that was going on sort of in Japanese pop culture at the time, with a lot of the anime influences, and creating something new that's obviously still having huge ripple effects going forward, and like only gaining popularity. That style of storytelling that they brought forth with Xenogears, and sort of like, refined. I don't know if they necessarily made it like bettered it with all the extra later games, but they've definitely sort of evolved, taking those sort of like high level explorations of stuff like psychology and religion, and wrapping it all in sort of an anime exterior, like drawing on stuff like Evangelion. I think that's still interesting. It's still unique in a lot of ways.
I really wanted to work a Matsuno question into this, but the original version of my Matsuno question was basically boiled down to, does it make you sad that he's not really prolific and making a lot of games
anymore? It makes me so sad, man.
I was a big Ogre Battle guy.
Yeah. And like Ogre Battle was my first introduction to his work without knowing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ogre Battle was, again, like I couldn't really believe what I was playing. I don't think I knew what I was doing. I didn't understand the story, but I was like, I knew this was different, right? The funny thing is like my introduction to Final Fantasy Tactics occurred when one of my best friend's stepbrother came back from Thailand. He went there with his girlfriend, and he came back with a bunch of bootleg games that weren't out yet. So he had Symphony of the Night and he had Final Fantasy Tactics, and he like played through all of Final Fantasy Tactics in Japanese without knowing a lick of Japanese. And so like I remember just watching him like chuck rocks at people like for hours and hours and somehow get through the whole game. And I was just like, oh, this is cool. Like I knew like Tactics caught a lot of people off guard because it came out right after 7. A lot of people were introduced to the genre, with 7, and they wanted something the same, and it had Final Fantasy name. And for me, like I had that early introduction, I knew exactly what it was. And I had played the Ogre Battle and lots of other, like I was into games like Warcraft and stuff on the PC. I did a lot of PC gaming. And so to see, this game from Matsuno telling this story that like, even without understanding a lick of it, because it was in Japanese, like we were still enthralled with the gameplay itself. And so then, 6 months later, it came out in North America. We all bought it. Still couldn't understand what was going on because the localization was awful, but still had a ton of fun. And I think that that's what's really interesting is like, I thought I knew what the story was and I thought it was awesome. And I think that kind of goes just to show how strong Matsuno's work is. Does it benefit from Alex O. Smith doing a localization like on Vagrant Story? Like, absolutely. But does it need it necessarily? Like, I don't I don't think so, because I think Final Fantasy Tactics can be compelling even if you don't know what's going on. And that's impressive because that's all structure, that's all character, that's all visual storytelling. And so, yeah, it makes me sad he doesn't make games anymore. Can you imagine what he'd be doing with 20 more years of experience? Like, I know he did some work on Final Fantasy 14 and random little stuff here and there, but I don't get why some of these Japanese creators kind of disappear. They have these legendary careers and then they make a mobile game and then they don't do anything. I don't know what's going on there, but
Masato Kato syndrome.
Kato, yeah. Kato is exactly who I'm talking about. I just downloaded another Eden because I heard it was Chrono Trigger 3 or something.
Chris played some of that.
Yeah.
I played a good chunk of it. Oh, just let us know how you feel.
I downloaded it 2 weeks ago and I haven't opened it. So I don't know. He said in an interview that he put all his ideas for Chrono Trigger 3 into another Eden. So I don't know.
He also put all his ideas from Chrono Trigger 1.
Yeah, did he? Yeah.
It's just there. Chrono Cross is literally in it. So anyway.
When discussing Final Fantasy X, you suggested some of its advancements on new hardware ended up feeling reductive, specifically the realistic character models and voice acting. Quote, it required less interpretation from me, the player, and so it lessened my empathetic attachment to its characters. I want to talk about that. Do you think the early aughts and the early HD era that followed it took their pursuit of fidelity over fantasy? Did that contribute to the genre's dip in popularity in the PS3 360 generation? Or was that more a function of our age, of reaching adulthood with a less malleable brain and more life and JRPG experience?
I think it's a little bit of a few things. I think it's absolutely like the time that I came to it. I think that's a really good observation because I was getting, I was growing up and my life was changing a lot around then. I was reaching the end of high school and that comes with a lot of change. But I still kept playing a lot of Japanese RPGs at the time. But I was drawn more to games like Suikoden 3 that, again, they were obviously a bit more realistic than the PlayStation games, but they still relied more on sort of abstract representations of characters through chibi models and caricatures of the character designs and stuff like that. For me, I go back and my first love has always been reading. I've been reading since I was tiny. I read a ton. My background is as a book blogger and a book reviewer. And so that's just the way my brain is wired. I am happy to, and I want to do a lot of the work. And so I was really drawn to the original Japanese RPGs, especially at the tail end of the Super Nintendo, because they had these really complex stories, but the player had to engage heavily, right? We were shown an abstract representation of what was happening in the story. And it was our job to fill that in our heads. And so everybody's experience was a little bit different because we all bring our own experiences and we all interpret those happenings in the game in a slightly different way. And I think that that's really cool. And that's what I love about books, right? Everybody sees the Battle of Pelennor Field a little bit differently. Everybody pictures the Nazgul a little bit differently, right? Some people might draw in the Nazgul from the film. Some people might, think back to the Ralph Bakshi semi-pseudo cartoon and think of those Nazgul. And that's what I really like about books. And that's what I like about those older Japanese RPGs. And that started to go away during the shift in the PlayStation 2 era, but very strongly kind of in the PlayStation 3, 360 era, when the entire genre jumped to HD and then really started to push hyper realism, especially as there was, a rise in sort of hyper realistic military shooters, and Grand Theft Auto took off during that PlayStation 2 era and then kind of really started pushing boundaries of realism in the next generation. And I think that Japanese RPGs were always bound to have a hit a doldrums during that phase. I don't think people were pushed away by the hyper realism or the push towards realism. I think that that's maybe even more broadly acceptable, or not even acceptable, but desired by a larger portion of people, because I don't think everybody necessarily wants to put forward that effort of piecing together stuff in their heads based on abstract sprites and poorly translated dialogue and stuff like that. So I think for me, it was definitely a change in age, a change in desire for how I wanted to interface with these games. But then I think it kind of the genre just hit a whole wall as it shifted over into the HD era that really desired that hyper realism without necessarily giving space at the time for kind of the more abstract stuff that I think we see a lot more of now, right? I wouldn't call Xenoblade Chronicles necessarily hyper realistic. There's a lot more stylization in graphics nowadays than back then. Whereas like, Final Fantasy 15, I would say kind of tends more towards that hyper realistic end of the spectrum.
You're driving an actual car.
Yeah, well, yeah. And you know what? And I think for me, like, again, I really like Final Fantasy 15 despite all its flaws. I also just wonder if maybe like the tech wasn't there to support hyperrealism at the time in a way that satisfied my brain, right? Like when I go into the world of Final Fantasy 15, it's beautiful and it's fun to explore. And I like seeing all the vistas because what we can represent with tech now matches or exceeds stuff that I can create in my head. Whereas like, Final Fantasy X is beautiful in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily like surpassing the way I saw scenes playing out in some of the older Final Fantasy games. I feel as impressed by a lot of 3D graphics now as I did by, high-end 2D sprite work back in, 1997 or whatever.
The way the genre kind of reverted back to the abstract in terms of abandoning the hyper-realism that it was seeking in the early era, is that how you think that the genre survived that kind of those dark years, as you call them?
Yeah. So a big chunk of the back half of the book is exploring that jump to the HD era and how challenging that was for Japanese RPGs. Final Fantasy 13 is like the famous example, right? There's the quote, like HD towns are hard, which was just like absurd. Yep. Like it was because other games were doing it, but it just showed how challenging it was for Japanese developers specifically due to like a whole lot of factors. Like they like to create their own game engines, right? They weren't really interested at the time in adopting middleware and software solutions to like speed up the process. And so there, that's just sort of like corporate culture that didn't facilitate that leap to HD consoles. And I also don't think they necessarily knew how to create games and stories within those worlds and within the boundaries of like those hyper realistic settings. I find that Sakaguchi's games at the time are really interesting because like Blue Dragon Pursued, like it wanted to look the way you remembered a PlayStation game looking, right? Like it had, or even a Super Nintendo game looking, it had the Akira Toriyama art like really fully realized and had this like really beautiful cartoony world to run around in. And it remains, and at the time, I think, it remains one of the most interesting looking Japanese RPGs of that era. Because it didn't try to pursue like hyperrealism. It pursued something that was like still artistic, still like representative of something else that wasn't trying to mirror what was happening in other genres at the time. And while they all kind of stumbled on consoles, a lot of the creators jumped ship over to the portable systems. And there was a meme going around Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and it was like, for every like, list a game that you enjoyed from a year going backwards. So you start in 2022, go down to 2021 and so on. And I was doing that, and it was like a bunch of like console games. And then all of a sudden I hit a certain year and it was like 8 handheld games in a row. And I felt like that was really kind of illustrative of like that jump where like, to me, handheld gamings came with these like constraints in technology, which I've always felt have benefited Japanese RPGs because I think that the possibilities and the opportunity for like scope creep in Japanese RPGs is so big. I've always felt like constraints are good. And so handheld systems offered that. Low resolution screens, not necessarily a lot of storage and not necessarily a lot of processing power, but they also created a lot of freedom because creators could take chances in a way that they hadn't been able to probably since the Super Nintendo. They didn't necessarily feel like they had to make a 60-hour RPG. They could make a 20-hour RPG that was just really solid front to back. They could experiment in like visual design. Like I really like 4 Warriors of Light. It's a Nintendo DS game that's like a Final Fantasy spin-off, and then it spun off into Bravely Default. And like it doesn't get everything right, but it pursues this sort of like pop-up storybook look to the world that I thought was really enchanting that you never would have got on consoles at the time because it was, it was too risky to try anything that wasn't sort of a surefire visual design. And so you just got lots of handheld focused design and graphic design that stands up really well. And I miss it. I miss it for all genres. Like now that we've got the Switch, everything feels like a console game. And there's very few games that still feel like a dedicated handheld game. And that era of Japanese RPGs, especially on the Nintendo consoles, I think are really unique in that way. And I look back fondly on those handheld Japanese RPGs the same way that I look back on like the best of the PlayStation RPGs. They fit into like a different niche in my life, right? I was commuting a lot. I lived on an island, so I was riding a ferry a lot, riding a lot of buses. So like then I was, it wasn't about sharing experiences with my friends necessarily, but it was about like all of those moments of downtime being filled with, like something in my pocket that like presented like adventure and escape from having to sit on a ferry for 20 minutes. And so for me personally, it came about at the best time. Like I stopped a lot of console games because I just didn't have time, right? I was getting older and I had, a job and a girlfriend and all sorts of other commitments. So I just wasn't sitting around at home as much. And I think a lot of people were going through that, maybe some of those same experiences, right? People who grew up, born in the 80s, grew up through the 90s. And then all of a sudden this generation, like we're the first generation to like really grow up with video games, and we were all reaching adulthood at the same time. And so I think that portable nature kind of hit a whole generation of gamers at the right time. I mean, what kid didn't dream of being able to take Final Fantasy VI out of the house, right? And then all of a sudden you can do that. And then you have more and more and more RPGs. So I think there's a whole lot of things going on. I think, handheld kind of saved the genre at that time. Absolutely. Helped it kind of keep and maintain momentum. But I also think it was just the right place for Japanese RPGs at the time. I don't think there was a way out of getting through the HD jump that wasn't going to result in a lot of growing pains for the genre on consoles.
Regarding Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, you wrote, left in the wake were characters that wanted so desperately to be human but had no soul at all, which, chef's kiss. That movie had its own problems, but as we near middle age, do you worry that all JRPG characters and stories may start to feel this way? That we've seen every remix of character trope available to a genre's narrative? And does that matter? At this point, isn't there enough to enjoy if there's a quality story, regardless of its potential to surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly on the latter half of that. Like as I get older, I kind of find myself like seeking out and enjoying favorite tropes more and more. So I don't mind if we have people falling into tropes and we have recognizable story structures. Like I'm playing Xenoblade 3 and I know it's a Takahashi story. It's going to have a lot of twists and turns. I made a joke on Twitter the other day about something like referencing Xenogears and Xenoblade 3 and stuff. And the person I was talking with was like, you're actually like pretty much spot on. And I was like, I was like, oh, that was a joke. Like, I was just like, I was trying to say that the main character Xenoblade was like a mix of these two Xenogears characters. I feel like I can be shocked, but not necessarily surprised, but that's okay for me because I like you say, I kind of like enjoy just finding, as long as they're good executions of those tropes, like I like them. Right? Like I seek out tropes and familiar and comfortable books sometimes just because I like to be able to fall back on those stories that I enjoy. If it's all that, is that good? Like, not really. Like, I think that's one of the reasons like the Nier games are so popular is because they kind of shuck a lot of like the typical or expected tropes that you might find in Japanese RPGs, or at least like subvert them or kind of like, put a spin on them. And so I think you can take lots of tropes, you mix and match in ways that might be, like create new stressors on that trope or that theme and see what happens. But I also think that it's hard for anything to be entirely unique or brand new nowadays, right? Like everything kind of comes back to certain story structures and ideas and themes that we're kind of exploring as societies right now. So I think it's natural for things to kind of fall back on familiar tropes because we want to explore the challenges in our lives, and those tropes often reflect those. And like time is a circle, so like it's not a surprise we're still exploring the same themes, feeling the same crises that like Tolkien did when he wrote Lord of the Rings.
Like a JRPG protagonist, we're always doomed to repeat our cycles until we expire.
Right. Here we are.
You mentioned Nier. Do you think Nier's appeal is exclusive to players seasoned in games? And do you think that makes a game like Nier hard to recommend? Like whenever you say you should play Nier, do you make like the teeth sucking noise, or is it just like something that you think anyone can handle?
Yeah, I mean, I apologize every time I recommend Nier, and basically have to tell, like now that the remake is out, it's easier to recommend. But absolutely, I would recommend Nier and apologize for it, like in the same sentence, like without even a period, like in a single sentence. But I would recommend it wholeheartedly because it's like it was so unique and interesting. I found it through word of mouth. Like it looked bad. I remember when it was announced. I didn't really play the Drakengard games. I knew it was sort of related to them, but all I knew was that they were kind of bad, supposedly. But then everybody kept talking about Nier. And it's like, okay, I guess I need to buy this. And I got it on Xbox and and played it and loved it. And it's so weird. And it's like the original it's not, I don't think it's good, but it's so unique. And the experience is like the opposite of what I was just talking about. It wasn't like anything I had played before. And it challenged me and pushed me and kind of trolls the player in ways that you're like, oh, okay, this is like, you can really feel like the creator behind this. You could feel like this was before Taro was like a household name among fans, but like you could really feel his personality in the game, which was like pretty rare outside of like Yuji Horii or Kawazu games, right? Especially this kind of late in the cycle. Like it's been a long time since games were small enough that a single creator could kind of like come through in their game the way that Taro did in Nier. But I mean, like, I think Automata's sold 5 million copies or something like that. I don't know the exact number, but like a lot of copies. So like, no, I don't think it's just for hardcore fans. I don't know how. Like, I couldn't explain to you how Nier became a huge success. Like, I don't know what dice rolled the right way in our timeline for that to happen. I feel like it's one of those things is like, you know, if you roll 100 universes, like Nier becomes a smash hit in one of them.
Yeah.
And we just happen to be in that one. And it's great. And it's great to see that like the genre can take chances and not just like be successful, but like grow a new audience. That Nier meme that went around with that like church, that like hidden door.
Yeah, that was
like
crazy.
The internet was like blowing up over for like, you know, for a couple of days. And then it turned out to be like a ARG, like a ad for a modding tool. But like seeing the whole internet, like even mainstream gaming sites like blowing up over this like door somebody found in a 5-year-old Nier game. Like I was just like, how did we get here? And like, this is great. Like I love it, but how did we get here? And I don't know. Life's not a meritocracy. The best stuff doesn't always make it, but sometimes it does. Nier is just like that combination of like luck and timing and ingenuity and just being its own thing, like unapologetically its own thing. And it just worked and it's great. And I don't know how it can open doors for other games, because I don't think a game could try to be Nier and be successful, but it does show that you can make money on new ideas. And that's something that capitalism needs to be reminded of.
There was recently some sort of live stream or anniversary event for something where there was a certain subset of like the Nier fandom that was expecting Nier 3 to be announced. I don't remember what this live stream was, but and of course Nier 3 was not announced. But to your point, my brain has still not rationalized a world where even Nier 3 is going to exist because of how weird the first two games are. Like Square Enix Corporation greenlighting Nier 3, which I'm sure they'll do because the game makes money. It still does not make sense. It's like a weird cognitive dissonance that I still have not gotten over yet.
Well, it's weird. They did Drakengard 3 with Taro in between both of those two, and that's an even weirder one.
There's a Nier mobile game, like a Nier gacha mobile game. Like, what? It's again, like I'm not into the gacha games, but it's great that exists, right? Like Nier crossover in Final Fantasy 14.
2B is in Soul Calibur.
I don't have an answer for it. I love it. It's one of those like mysteries of the universe that I'm just happy it exists, and I'm just gonna not question it so it doesn't get taken away.
I'm going to think about this conversation every time I see my little Emil figure that's sitting up there on my shelf over there. We talked about this a little bit already, but one of my favorite sections of the book were the chapters dealing with the dark years of the Japanese RPG, mostly because I was kind of out at that point in time. I kind of fell out of the fandom for a while just because I hadn't gotten into handheld gaming yet and I was just out of there. But that section begins with like a survey of Sakaguchi's post-Square career and the formation of Mistwalker, which I found really interesting. Those games, in my brain, those games were kind of coded as failures because they failed to like breathe life for JRPGs into the Xbox 360 ecosystem or the console ecosystem. Speaking specifically of the last story, which I've never played, you've sold me on the last story because you point out that it takes place in like a single location. I think it's like a fortress island or something. And I am somebody, for like all of its faults and all the many ways that this game disappointed me, I liked Dragon Age 2 because I liked that like one setting that you could kind of grow up with. That game failed to like fully realize that, but I like that idea. We've talked about Xenoblade a lot in this podcast, but it seems like there's a prerequisite size and scale that Japanese RPGs need to be. Why do you think that they're kind of feel obligated to be large scale epic adventures and we don't see more small scale stories told in this regard?
I think just the history of the genre sort of informed that and informed people's expectations, right? It had always been that. And so you did see like smaller sort of like settings sometimes. Like I think back again, like Earthbound and Mother and stuff like that, where some creators started to explore what else it could be. But it was really the PlayStation era where game lengths like really ballooned. Like I've been playing through a lot of old Japanese RPGs over the past few years as I kind of set up my old consoles and got an old tube TV and stuff. I track my times on How Long to Beat, which is a website that just tracks how long games are. And like a lot of them are like 30 hours. Right? Like Final Fantasy VI, I did everything I could, except like I could have maxed out all the espers on every character and spent 20 hours doing that. But otherwise, I did everything I could. I got all the items, did all the side quests, wiped the floor with the toughest bosses. And it was like 32 hours, something like that. I played through Final Fantasy VII recently and did most of everything, but didn't do any of the weapons. I used a guide for the Golden Chocobo. So that took me, an hour instead of like 15 hours like I would have spent on it as a kid. It still took me 45 hours. I think a lot of people remember those Super Nintendo RPGs being a lot longer than they are. Like Chrono Trigger on a fresh playthrough is like 17 or 18 hours. Super Mario RPG was like 15 hours. It was really the PlayStation when they started to really balloon in size. And I don't necessarily think that's because of scope of the story, but just as the technology for like navigating those worlds changed. The fact that not all action and story was told through like dialogue boxes, but you started to have cutscenes, FMV cutscenes, and you started to have 3D spaces to explore, and like 3D space just takes longer to explore, right? There's a third axis, so it takes, it's not as fast as a 2D space. That all added up, and games just started getting longer and longer and longer. Like Xenogears is like 60 hours. I could have beat Final Fantasy VI twice in the time that's taken me to do Xenogears. And I don't necessarily know that like that was natural or required of the genre. I think we saw an explosion in like opportunity during the PlayStation era when people like Takahashi like weren't required to like scope out a game before they started making it. And that extended on to like the original Xenoblade. Like I was just watching a history of Xenoblade Chronicles on YouTube, and it was saying that Takahashi got this idea of the two giants fighting, right? And then like killing each other at the same time, and then they become the land that the game takes place on. And so he made a figurine of these two like giants in battle. And then he took it to a pitch meeting with Nintendo and said, here's my figurine. This is the game I want to make. This figurine represents the world that the game will take place on. And Nintendo was like, yeah, that's cool. Where's the rest of the pitch? And he said, there is no rest of the pitch. This is the pitch. It was like, like a literal statue that exists now. I want it. There was no scoping out the project ahead of time. And did Xenoblade Chronicles need to be as big as it was? Did those regions really need to be that big? Like, I would argue that they don't. But I also think that that's just sort of the nature of exploring new technologies and like new opportunities, that creators want to go big. I started this interview telling you guys that I would have been happy to write a book that was twice as long, right? But my editor was like, yeah, no, it can't be that long. It's as long as it can be at 110,000 words. I would have added 50,000 words, like no problem if somebody had let me. And I think it's the same with games, but I don't necessarily know that like for a long period of time, like a decade, that there was necessarily anybody saying like, oh no, like you need to rein that in. Like you need to like cut some of this stuff. And it's okay to cut some of this stuff. I always come back to Chrono Trigger because it's like there's nothing extra in that game. Like everything is like refined down to like the bare essentials. And we lost that in Japanese RPGs for a long time. And so then I think it started to become a selling point, because how, like, if you're appealing to like a 17-year-old gamer who has like a budget for a few games a year, and you're like, oh yeah, this game's 90 hours long. Like, are they going to buy that, or are they going to buy some platformer that they can beat in 6 hours? And so then like length started to become a marketing tool to say like, hey, this is worth your money. And I think it just got tied sort of intentionally in some ways to the genre, that it just had to be bigger and longer and more epic. Then you look at Undertale, and it's not a Japanese made game, but it's probably one of the most kind of culturally influential Japanese RPG adjacent games ever released. The Pope was playing one of the songs. Like, yeah. The Pope, yeah. Right? Like, has heard a song from Undertale. Like that just blows my mind. He's probably never heard any of Xenogears music, yeah. But he's heard something from Undertale, which, was based on a song from Live Alive, right? And so that's another JRPG that's like small in scope intentionally. It's like 7 or 8 small stories all lumped together and then tied together in the end. And I think that that's really interesting. It shows how telling concise stories in this medium can be really compelling. Then you look on the flip side, like Octopath Traveler takes the same idea, 8 different stories, but its execution was really kind of lacking because it was too long and then there was no real tie together. It just felt like really disparate and everything took way too long. You know, I got 40 hours into it and was like halfway through some of the stories and I was like, this is too much.
Yeah.
And so like that discipline, I think, is something that creators could really work on. And that's where I turn to like the indie space again. I think there's some really interesting games in the indie space, games like Cosmic Star Heroine. It's kind of a futuristic Phantasy Star espionage JRPG. It's quite short. It's like under 10 hours, I think. And it's like really focused on like every moment being like really like taut and tightly designed. Every battle you start with like full resources. So like every battle is like a puzzle that you're trying to figure out how to get through combat using every tool that you have. Like you're never saving a potion for that boss you might need later. Like you go all out every battle. So then battles can be kind of more challenging and intricate, but there's fewer of them and there's no random battles, right? And that creates something that like you're never backtracking and fighting 15 battles just because you took the wrong tunnel. And that kind of stuff, I think, just created an artificial sense of like scale and length and size that JRPG started to chase as an ideal when it wasn't necessarily always a virtue. I don't think every game needed to be as long as it was.
We talked a little bit already about the dark years of the Japanese RPG. I remember the moment in which I fell off of JRPGs during the dark years. It was when I was trying to choose a console. Like if I was going to buy a PS3 or a 360, I was leaning PlayStation because I figured that's where Final Fantasy would land. But also I wanted to understand what kind of JRPGs were coming to the system. And the Mistwalker games were not announced yet. At least I didn't know about them at the time. And I saw a trailer, I think on IGN, for a game I think developed by Level 5 called White Knight Chronicles. And it looked so cool. And I was like, this is what this next generation is going to be like. For me, every month I can walk into the store and just grab the new Japanese RPG off the shelf and experience it fresh, just like I did in the PlayStation 1 era. But I'm curious, though, just thinking about middling JRPGs that didn't quite do anything for pretty much anybody. Did you play any for this book or recently that kind of encapsulate that struggle to adjust to the HD era?
I mean, there's tons of them, right? I think like Final Fantasy 13 is obviously emblematic of like the challenge then. Mm-hmm. Like it couldn't really get, it did a lot of things pretty good, but didn't really bring anything to the table that was like, the battle system was actually pretty cool. But again, like it's sort of splitting hairs between like, yeah, okay, I guess the battle system was pretty good. And I fell off at the same time. Like there just wasn't enough out there. I came to the PlayStation 3 was too expensive. I came to it like really late in the cycle. I did have an Xbox, and that's where I played Final Fantasy 13, the Mistwalker games, but like Tales of Vesperia, I really liked. But like all of these games, I don't think I finished any of them. Like I can't recall outside of like I played Persona 5 on my PlayStation 3. That might be the only one that I actually like truly finished.
And that was the very end.
Right at the tail end. Like, I don't know that like I really finished a lot, and that I played a ton of handheld games like we went over earlier, but they always seem to just like not quite get there. Like, Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon, I think had really good vision. Lost Odyssey was like, Sakaguchi's take on Final Fantasy. And a lot of people joke that it's the real Final Fantasy 13. And in a lot of ways, it feels like, a more genuine HD generation take on what the series was on the PlayStation 2 than 13 was. But to me, it all comes back to like all the excuses for 13. Like, like they never really told us why the game was great. It was like always about why it was bad or hard to make. And that to me just isn't very interesting. Like it's very clear that they struggled. It was clear that they struggled to make, compelling levels and worlds because the whole thing was just a hallway simulator until you hit a big open prairie. And I played the game. Everybody was like, oh, it gets good after 40 hours. And then I hit 40 hours. I got to the big open world area and I was like, this is not good anymore. and I had too many names and proper nouns in my head. And I was like, this has not compelled me about Japanese RPGs back in the day.
You read a really great paragraph with all the proper nouns for 13.
It's incredible. It's
really
absurd. And they're all in capitalized, and it's just
hyphenated.
It's crazy, right? And like I just feel like none of the games that came out during that era, and like White Knight Chronicles is another one. It looked cool. You got to be a big mech and stuff, and like there were lots of like interesting games that like kind of were flawed, but their flaws outweighed their ambitions. Whereas I think what happened like during the PlayStation era, which was another transitional era, is like you had games like Xenogears and Final Fantasy Tactics and lots of Square games like Chrono Cross, and then you had like Suikoden games, and they were all flawed in their own ways, but they were flawed in ways that define them less than their ambitions and their successes did. Whereas I think a lot of those HD generation JRPGs were like just dragged down by their flaws. And I should say, like, I really like Blue Dragon. I think it's a lot of fun. But at the same time, like, I think about it and I just think about finding all the little nothings. Like, for some reason, they just filled the world with, like, searchable areas, and you would search there and it would, like, nothing would pop up, right? I can't remember if it was nothing or whatever. But it was, like, that kind of stuff is just tedious. Like, I like clicking on every barrel, but if every barrel tells me there's nothing in it, that's just tedious, and it adds time onto playing the game, and I can't leave them alone. And that's the kind of experimentation that I just don't know. It just felt like they were trying to figure out what JRPGs were becoming. And I think ultimately the success that they ended up having, some of the most successful ones started bringing in ideas from Western games and kind of like broadening their idea of what Japanese RPGs could be.
On Final Fantasy 13, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I feel like Final Fantasy 13 right now is, in the past, I don't know, a couple of years, has had a reckoning or a renaissance maybe. Like I've heard more people that have gone back and enjoyed that game on Game Pass than I did when the game actually came out. And maybe this is just a product of our friends at the Every FNFF podcast. Like, I think they're covering that game now. Maybe that's why I'm thinking this. But do you think, like, if 13 would have stuck the landing, if it would have been a big hit, do you think that would have changed the trajectory, or do you think that we were always destined to head towards the handheld space where that abstraction could return?
Yeah, I think it was always going to happen. I think there were just too many growing pains, and like, I touch on this in the book. There's a whole chapter devoted to it, but I think just the structure of Japanese like video game developers and the corporate culture there was just made it impossible to transition into that era successfully without a lot of growing pains. I think they needed to rethink how they made video games. Even if Final Fantasy 13 had been a huge success. I mean, Final Fantasy 13 was a dud, and it took like a decade for the next game to come out, right? If Final Fantasy 13 was a huge success, would we have got Versus 13 2 years later? Like, and would it have been good? Probably not, right? Like, they flailed. It took them 10 years, and then the final result was like still not good. And then they added a ton of DLC to try to fix it. I love it, but it's not a great game. It's highs and lows, but it's like 15, even at its peak, isn't a great game. It's too flawed. And so that's what they were able to do with 10 years. Like, I don't know that they necessarily I don't know that their hubris would have allowed them to like capitalize on 13 being a huge success to create like another Final Fantasy that was like as good. Like, could they have ever returned to the PlayStation days when we got a Final Fantasy every year? Like, I don't think the tools were there. I don't think the structure of the development teams was there, and they needed to learn that along the way. And then that's just Square with all the money in the world, right? I don't know that smaller companies, like, how was Konami ever going to make Suikoden games on the PlayStation 3? Like, how was that ever going to happen? Breath of Fire, how are any of those games ever going to come out on the PlayStation 3, right? That's where the handhelds came in. They gave playgrounds to those developers to kind of continue to work at a scale that was like closer to, I mean, it was closer to the PlayStation and Super Nintendo than it was even to the PlayStation 2, but still within that ballpark. They knew how to make those games. They knew how to budget them. They knew how to use tools to create games of that size, write scripts for games of that size. So I don't know. I don't think anything could have changed it, to be honest.
You wrote, from the moment Yuji Ori decided to translate the tabletop role-playing experience for home consoles, and Hironobu Sakaguchi seeded Final Fantasy with science fiction elements, JRPGs have been emerging of past and future, a way to experience the non-linearity of time. That's a profound statement, and it's something I never considered before. And one of the pulls I got from that is, do you believe JRPGs age better than other genres of games? Are they better at transcending their status as commercial products than something like Gears of War or literally any other game?
I think so. For me personally, they do for sure. Like I find it easier to go back and play older Japanese RPGs. Again, it kind of depends on era, right? Like if you have like really solid kind of like refined and polished RPGs like the tail end of Super Nintendo or some of like the heights of the PlayStation, there's not a lot of like flaws in there, right? I mean, there's flaws, but like they have purpose and they understand what they're meant to be. And that's really easy to go back to. I think that Japanese RPGs, older ones especially, are generally pretty simple in their systems, and that helps. They rely less on the photorealism that we've been talking about. They rely less on sort of like a robust graphical experience. Like Xenogears, like artistically, it's very interesting. Technologically, it's like a mess. It's super pixely. Like the textures on the polygons are really low resolution. I'm playing on like a 27-inch CRT. Like it's a beautiful TV, but like it still looks like a mess a lot of the time. But it's like, because it uses that abstract style, it holds up better and looks better than playing something like, you know, Max Payne or Tony Hawk or something like that, right? Like Tony Hawk is still fun, but it looks like a mess, right? Because it tried to have like that more realistic look to it. And I also think like as you think about like the idea of something like aging or like, you know, aging better than other genres, is like you look at how much other genres were kind of created and improved upon. And I don't know that like the modern Japanese RPG is that different than Final Fantasy 1. Like the ideas are very much the same. Whereas with something like Gears of War, like those third-person shooters that, you know, were really popular in the 360 era, like those didn't really exist before, right? Like you look at like Siphon Filter on the PlayStation, like, but you go back further than that and it's kind of hard to find them. Then you have to go to like first-person shooters, but that's different. And so you have genres that were sort of growing up and evolving, and like they changed a lot over time, right? Like something like Uncharted kind of fits that cast of like that third-person action adventure game. You know, but like, do you go back to like Crash Bandicoot where you're running through environments, like dodging like enemies and stuff like that? Like, how do you kind of find the equivalent of that as you go backwards? Whereas Japanese RPGs, like there's like Dragon Quest 11 is not very different than Dragon Quest 1. And like, that might not work for a lot of people, but it works for me. So I do find it easy. Like my brain doesn't have to travel very far to relearn how to play those older games. And that helps. I don't have to forgive them as much as I do some other genres. But on the flip side, you know, I play Super Mario Kart all the time, and it's just as fun as Mario Kart 8. And so, like, you know, I think some genres age better than others. I don't think JRPGs are exclusive in that, but I definitely think they're one of the ones that, like, a good JRPG is going to be good in perpetuity, the same way a good novel is good, you know, now or in 50 years.
It's an excellent comparison.
You talked a little bit about this before, and I'm glad you did, because we cannot ask intelligent Final Fantasy 14 questions, because I don't think either one of us have played it at all. But I do think the story of it is very interesting and very essential to the larger narrative that you're telling in the book. So I think that the comeback story, which you go into in the book, and also you talk a little bit towards the end about the influence of the indie space, and you talked about this earlier in this podcast too, where you're talking about Quartet with Pat Holloman. There's another game on the horizon, Sea of Stars, these games that have kind of embraced what Japanese RPGs gave to us 20 years ago and are trying to rekindle that right now in this modern space. I think those are really great capstones for the story, but like if you had to write this book, DLC for this book in 10 years, what do you think the next few chapters would be about? Like, what are your predictions for the shifts and the trends in this genre?
One of the chapters near the end of the book talks about Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think I ended up calling that section Rose-Colored Materia, but the original section title was Weaponized Nostalgia. And I think that kind of encompasses a lot of what I think is going to happen with JRPGs and like games as a whole. I don't think it's like a coincidence that it took 25 years or 22 years or whatever it was for Final Fantasy VII to be remade. And I think the reason that it was remade when it was is because like the kids who were playing Final Fantasy VII in their basement, like the 16-year-olds, they have kids now. And those kids represent an opportunity to like create a new generation of fans. Cause like, I mean, Chris, you can probably relate to this, but like, I love sharing the stuff I love with my kids, right? Like I love bringing them into the things that I love. I love holding on to things. Like I love Tolkien. I love The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I've been holding on to The Hobbit, the book, for years because I want to make sure that my eldest is like the right age for it so that she can love it as much as I did at that age. And I think that's happening with games. I think Final Fantasy VII got remade because you have a generation of players who are in their late 30s, 40s that are going to buy it because they're like, even if they don't like video games or Japanese RPGs anymore, they're like, oh, like Final Fantasy VII is like the greatest game of all time. Like I love that game. They're going to buy it anyway. There's going to be people who buy it and then they're going to introduce it to their kids, right? And their kids are going to have those same memories of Final Fantasy VII when they're 12 as their parents did. Different game, different experience, but that same sort of like love for it. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that happening in Japanese RPGs over the next decade, not just from like major remakes, but you look at like Final Fantasy XIV is starting to tap into older games for a lot of its content. Like it had a whole thing based on Matsuno's work, right? Where like the players could go to Ivalice and Final Fantasy Tactics characters and stuff were in there. Like why all of a sudden are you tapping into a game that like 40-year-old dudes like? Like I don't think the average age of Final Fantasy 14 players is 38, 39. There's lots of younger players, but you start bringing in some of these games that the older players play. Like I play Final Fantasy 14 on and off, but like you tell me there's going to be Final Fantasy Tactics content in there and I'm a heck of a lot more likely to sign up, right? The kind of flip side of that coin is I also think, and I touched on this earlier, is like the people making games now, like the up and coming game developers like Pat, like the people doing Sea of Stars, they grew up playing these games and we're the first generation, like the people kind of coming into their 40s and the early 40s, late 30s, like we're the first generation who really grew up with Japanese RPGs like as like a constant in our life from a very young age. And so now you have those people running studios and making new games and their experiences wanting to bring back that feeling for a new generation of players is going to inform a lot of how Japanese RPGs change over time. I think we're going to see a little bit looking to the past for like ideas and inspiration than sometimes we always have. Like the idea that like Final Fantasy, I think Final Fantasy 16 is going to be a bit of an outlier in the way that it's like really trying to like shake things up. And Final Fantasy always tries to shake things up. And I think, like we're seeing all of a sudden a bunch of tactical RPGs coming out, like stuff like Triangle Strategy and like Tactics Ogre Reborn. Like those are not games we would have seen 5 or 6 years ago, right? The Diofield Chronicles, like that's another like tactical strategy RPG. And I think we're seeing those for a reason. And I think that's probably because like you have a generation of creators and like people with like high purchasing power, like, who are people sort of in our age range with families who represent that opportunity to like tap into that nostalgia from a business perspective, but also just from like a satisfying creative perspective. Like, there's always this desire in business that like everything's got to be newer and bigger and better and faster. But like sometimes that opportunity to be like, oh, let's look at the stuff that like everybody loved 15 years ago, whether it's like high-waisted jeans and mullets or it's like turn-based combat systems. People loved them 15 years ago, 20 years ago, like people are going to love them again now, as long as you can kind of give them a new twist.
By the way, the version of the copy of The Hobbit that you're saving for your kids, my version of that is showing them 35-year-old episodes of Dragon Ball.
Oh, yes. There you go. I like it. Yeah.
That's how we do it.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Avatar is another one for me. Avatar, The Last Airbender, not the James Cameron movie.
The good Avatar.
But yeah, the good Avatar. Yeah. Hanging on to it. But yeah, Dragon Ball. I mean, Dragon Ball was it for us for a long time as well. Well, like the Frieza saga, and then it would roll over to start all over again. But
did you really completely start over at the end of Final Fantasy VII's first disc at the Genova Life Battle? And I was curious if that was the most drastic L you've ever taken in an RPG.
I did. It was awful. So, I talked earlier in the podcast about how often I would be introduced to like new games just through playing with friends, right? And I remember when PlayStation came out, and my friend who got every console right away, he got everything right away. We went over to his house, we holed up in his bedroom and played Final Fantasy VII. And I just we were in trance. We stayed up all night playing it. And I went home the next morning. I was like, Dad, I got to get a PlayStation. And I don't know how I did it, but my dad said yes. So we went, and again, I lived on a small island. So there was lag time, right? Like, got to wait until shopping day to get over there. But we got there a week or two later, bought a PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII at the Sony store. But my friend and a few other friends who had it were like, they were further ahead than I was, right? And so like we would swap stories on the bus and the ferry ride to school every day and like, catch up with each other. Like, how far are you? How'd you beat this boss? That kind of stuff. But I was behind. So I was just racing as hard as I could to catch up to them. They were around the end of the first disc when I got it. And so I was racing through. And then I got to that Genova Life battle and I couldn't beat it. It was like I was too underleveled, and the situation I was in made it really hard to level. I don't know if I was completely locked out of like being able to level up or just not smart enough to figure out how. So I started the game over again and just kind of took that L and took it slower and enjoyed myself a lot more at that point. But that wasn't the biggest loss, like biggest L I've taken. I can think of like two others. One where I got bailed out by a friend, and that was Final Fantasy Tactics. And like you could save in a city, like because it was like node-based map. You move around, you get to a city, you buy some new equipment, you save. But this particular city, when you tried to leave, you would get into a battle, and it was a battle against Gafgarion in like some executioner city. There were a bunch of guillotines around. I could not beat it. Like I was too underleveled. It was so hard. I couldn't beat it, but I was stuck there. I didn't have backup save, so I couldn't leave. Yeah. But my friend, same guy who had Final Fantasy VII, he was just good at video games. And so he bailed me out. I had like a bunch of squires. He somehow beat the battle with a bunch of like squires and underleveled. Because that's right. You could also send your characters off. That's what happened. You could send your characters off on little jobs, and then they would be gone from your party. So they were all gone from my party. I had only underleveled characters. He somehow managed to beat Gafgarion. So he saved my buns after about 30 hours. But the absolute worst, and I was telling you guys a little bit about this before the cast, but like it's like a 20-year story, 20 years of like secret resentment, like a redemption arc, everything. It's good. We had one copy of Final Fantasy VI that would bounce around our friend group. This wasn't my babysitter's copy. This was another copy. I don't know who it belonged to, but it was finally my turn to play Final Fantasy VI. So I played it. I put in 50 hours or whatever, and I was in Kafka's Tower right at the very end of the game. But I was playing at my friend's house on his Super Nintendo. A bunch of us were over, and we would often do that. And so I was up in the bedroom and I was playing. I got to Kafka's Tower, but then had to save. So I saved at like the very last save spot in the game. Turned off the Super Nintendo, or left it run. No, I left it running. That's important. Saved, and then went down for dinner or whatever. And then we were just hanging out later. And then my friend came down, and he was next on the list to get the game, right? So he, like, when I was done, he was going to get to play it. And he was like, man, I'm sorry. I kicked the Super Nintendo. Now your save's gone. And I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, yeah, I kicked it and now your save's gone. I was like, that's not how this works, dude. And so for 20 years, I was convinced he erased my save game so that he could get the copy of it faster and get to play it sooner. I was mad. And so I never beat Final Fantasy VI. I played right up until the end. I'd seen the ending because I'd seen a friend beat it. So I didn't beat Final Fantasy VI until the Game Boy re-release a number of years later. But then fast forward like 20 years, like this was like 2019 maybe. I just got a new tube TV. I hooked up my Super Nintendo, hooked up my copy of Chrono Trigger. I had a day off work. I had a big bag of candy. I was going to just play Chrono Trigger all day. And I was going to like live tweet through my playthrough of the game. So I was live tweeting first 45 minutes or so. It was going good. I was making sure to save. I was having a good time. I was making good time. I was in the future, I think. I went to grab some candy and I kicked my Super Nintendo and my game locked up.
Oh no.
And so I was like, oh shit. Okay, well, I just saved. That's okay. So I reset. Turns out if you like nudge the cartridge and it gets all garbled, if you turn the power off, you're good. If you hit the reset button, you can mess up like the SRAM that saves your games. I hit reset, the game restarted, and only my last save file was gone. The other two were still there. It's like 20 years later, I was like, oh shit, he actually did kick the Super Nintendo and it just erased my save. And so I should apologize to him, but I never have. But I did lose an entire Final Fantasy VI playthrough to a friend kicking my Super Nintendo and then didn't believe him for 20 years. So
God, that's a great story of that coming back around.
I owe my apologies. And then I did a bunch of research into like how that could possibly happen, trying to justify my resentment. But I was wrong. I was wrong that whole time.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Did you didn't have anything else, did you, Eric?
Well, there was one where Aidan reveals his favorite Final Fantasy, but he is supposed to go on the Every F and FF podcast, and I imagine they will ask him that question. So I will plug them and say, listen to Every F and FF as well.
Yes. Do it. Do it now.
I can't do it.
Okay, let's go on to our Patreon questions. Thanks for submitting some questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. This one from Mike and Cheese, which is a great name. What are or were some Eastern trends in storytelling, art, or gameplay that didn't work as well for Western audiences, and why?
I think like it's really interesting to look at the early NES RPGs, JRPGs, to like find some of the best trends that didn't take at first, but then eventually did take off once the genre sort of like got a fair shake from publishers and stuff. And two of those are like, you look at Persona, which is huge now. Yeah. And then you look at something like Undertale, which we talked about earlier, which is Western made, but has like a huge audience. And I think it like deserves sort of a place in JRPG canon, though I don't cover it in the book really. Both of those I think can be traced back to games that were released in Japan on the NES, like Persona, it's like parent series Shin Megami Tensei, like it was created on the NES like way long ago, and it never made it overseas, and it was, you know, deemed just too serious, too dark, touched on way too many like touchy themes to ever kind of release at that time over here. And I think the idea was like, you know, Western fans weren't into that kind of thing, but you fast forward 25 years, a couple of decades, and like Persona is huge, right? Soul Hackers 2 is coming out and people are excited for it. And Soul Hackers 2 is going to sell, you know, it's not going to do Persona numbers, but it's going to sell a heck of a lot more than anybody in like 1985 thought Shin Megami Tensei would ever do. And I think that like that just kind of shows that I don't think there's anything that's really off the table. The fan base in Western countries is so big that there's going to be enough people who want to, you know, who are into anything, as long as it's scoped properly and budgeted properly, I would say. And then like Earthbound Mother was never released on the NES for similar reasons. And it went on to be moderately successful, or at least find a big fan base with Earthbound. But then Mother 3 never came out. The fan translation's incredible. It's like, it's an amazing game and it has to come out at some point, but it never came out. But like, again, Undertale is huge. And so like the appetite is there, and the games influence the right people in the right way to kind of find that audience. I don't think there's anything that's totally off limits for Western audiences, but you kind of have to find the right people to kind of care to push it and give that opportunity.
Piggybacking on that one, Ryan M. asks, are there any JRPG series that were actually more popular in the West than in Japan?
I mean, I think there's some instances where series like Final Fantasy and stuff probably sell more overall copies in like North America and South American regions and Europe. Whereas like Dragon Quest sells bucket loads in Japan, but doesn't do as well over here. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there's any like real like standouts. Like, I don't know, is Nier popular in Japan? Like, or is that sort of like a Western phenomenon?
That's what popped in my head, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any like, you know, that are kind of had big surprising hits. Like I do wonder about like the Fire Emblem series and whether I'd have to like start digging around for like sales numbers, but like, you know, the whole like kind of shipping culture that Fire Emblem has gone into feels to me like a really sort of Western thing right now.
Yeah, a Western fandom kind of thing. Yeah.
But I don't know enough about what's going on in Japanese fandom to really know. But that one strikes me as one that like, you know, might have a more like supersized Western audience compared to, relatively compared to Japan. But I'd have to start digging around for sales numbers and stuff.
I think we hit on this a little bit earlier, but Dylan Smith asks, can you trace the evolution of anime aesthetics in JRPGs? Talking character designs, narrative tropes, etc. Was this a natural development, or did one game / series innovate anime-style JRPG games?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, if you go back and if you consider, like, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy as, like, the foundations of the genre, I think they're really interesting because right from the beginning, there's that divergence, right? Like, Yuji Horii specifically wanted an artist like Akira Toriyama to work on Dragon Quest because he had mass appeal with like existing anime fans or manga fans. And so like the very first Japanese RPG, if you accept that that's Dragon Quest, was like anime and manga inspired. It had all of those tropes, the character designs, like it was Akira Toriyama, it looked like Dragon Ball. On the flip side, you then had Sakaguchi and Square, and they intentionally went into like the world of fine art to get their art. And that was an intentional choice to kind of separate it and make it seem more kind of serious than what Dragon Quest was doing. And so there's like that divergence, like right from the very beginning. And then you had Phantasy Star, which glommed more onto that anime and manga style. And then you had something like Mother and Shin Megami Tensei, which went sort of in their own directions. So I think from the very beginning of the genre, there's been like different paths along different art styles and tropes, narrative tropes from the very beginning. I know like Hori and Sakaguchi were both interested at looking at like some Western tropes. Like one of the reasons that, I can't remember if it was Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, but used like an epic fantasy setting was because like to the Japanese audience that the game was being created for, like stuff like, you know, knights in shining armor and those Western tropes are exotic to them. And so that was really interesting. It didn't feel like necessarily like, you know, the same old things we'd seen all along the way, because that audience hadn't necessarily experienced stuff like Terry Brooks and Stephen Donaldson and Ursula Le Guin and stuff in the 80s in the way that we had in the West. So it didn't feel tropey to them. And so like, you know, drawing in those Western tropes was kind of intrinsic in the genre to begin with. And then so you had, you know, divergence as Kodama and her team on Phantasy Star started looking at, you know, other tropes and other Western tropes like space opera as she started to create those series and games. So I think like from the beginning, it was sort of like a melting pot of trying to pull in like all sort, or not a melting pot, but like a mosaic of trying to pull in lots and lots of different tropes, ideas, and inspirations.
Aidan, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great conversation. I'm glad that you joined us today. Tell the people out there where to find you, where to find your book, where to pre-order it, etc.
Sure. So Fight Magic Items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West is coming out this October from Running Press. You can get it at like any of your favorite indie bookstores is going to be able to order a copy. Get in there and ask them, request it at your library. That's always excellent if you can do that. It helps them know which books to order, and libraries are great. You can also get it like anywhere you want online. If ebooks are your thing, all the major ebook retailers will have it. I also have a website that I've set up recently for it, fightmagicitems.rocks. And it has all the information you need. It has, you know, blurbs about the book. It has samples. It has links to purchase and pre-order and all sorts of goodies at the bottom. I'm continuing to add to that. And so that's always a good resource if you want to find out more about the book. You can find me on Twitter at A Dribble of Ink, ADRIBBLEOFINK. And just Google my name. I'm out there. I've got a few, like I said earlier, I've got a few freelance pieces coming up that I think the Retrograde Amnesia audience is really going to like. And so I'll be sharing those on Twitter and stuff. And, you know, with book promo season coming up, I have a few ideas, a few pretty good ideas, I think, of how to tell some more stories that didn't make it into the book.
Awesome.
If it wasn't obvious, both Chris and I read Fight Magic Items to completion, and we both enjoyed it.
I know. I was impressed and intimidated. Thought I could bullshit my way through this, but you guys started quoting me, and I was like, oh gosh, I got to go back.
It sharpened my knowledge of things that I already knew about, and it taught me stuff about games I didn't know much about, like Phantasy Star series.
Yeah, the sections filled in a lot of the gaps that I've had in my knowledge. I really enjoyed it, especially that personal touch that you gave in terms of your experience growing up.
Filled in a lot of my gaps, which was hard because like I've got gaps like anybody, and so like, you know, it would have been easy not to write about Phantasy Star because I haven't really played a lot of it, but I'm glad that comes through because it was easy to write about Final Fantasy VI, right? It was easy to write about some of the like games that have like, you know, had a big impact on me, but filling in all those holes and doing that research was a lot. I wrote the book in like 3.5 months too.
Wow.
Which was like not a great idea, but but it happened.
We checked all the boxes. We talked about the book. We talked about Xenogears, and we talked about the Sega Saturn. So I think we're good here. So Aidan, once again, we appreciate you joining the podcast. Until next time.
Yes, we will kill God.
And now you may go back to sleep.